Before we begin this incredible true story, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss our emotional and inspiring stories. Now, let's dive into a moment that shook the Vatican to its core. The morning sun cast long shadows across St. Peter's Square as thousands gathered in silence. Cardinal Marco Bellini stood near the front of the massive crowd, his weathered hands clutching a rosary that had belonged to his grandmother. He had served the Catholic Church for 43 years, but nothing had prepared him for this day. Pope Francis, the beloved leader who had touched millions of hearts around the world, passed away 3 days earlier at the age of 88. Today was his funeral, and the entire world seemed to pause in collective grief. The Swiss guards lined the pathway in their traditional Renaissance uniforms, standing as still as statues. Their yellow, red, and blue-striped uniforms were a symbol of loyalty that stretched back nearly 500 years. Among them stood Lieutenant Andreas Keller, a 32-year-old guard from a small village near Lucerne. Andreas had joined the Swiss Guards 7 years ago, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather before him. His family had served the Vatican for 3 generations, and the honor meant everything to him. As the funeral procession began, Andreas felt his heart pounding beneath his metal breastplate. He had protected Pope Francis during countless public appearances, had stood guard outside his chambers, and had even shared brief conversations with the humble pontiff, who always remembered the names of those who served him. Pope Francis had once asked Andreas about his mother's health after she had surgery. That simple act of kindness had cemented the Pope's place in Andreas's heart forever. The coffin, simple and wooden as Pope Francis had requested, was carried slowly toward the altar. The sound of thousands sobbing filled the square. Cardinals, bishops, world leaders, and ordinary people from every corner of the globe had come to pay their respects. The Pope had been a revolutionary figure, someone who had challenged traditions, embraced the poor, and preached mercy above judgment. His loss felt personal to so many. Andreas maintained his position. His halberd held perfectly upright, his face expressionless as training demanded. But inside, a storm was raging. His mind drifted to a conversation he had with Pope Francis just 2 weeks before his death. The Pope had called Andreas to his private study, an unusual request that had made the young guard nervous. "Andreas," the Pope had said in his gentle Argentine accent, "I want to thank you for your service. But more than that, I want to remind you that rules and traditions exist to serve love, not the other way around. Never forget that." At the time, Andreas had nodded respectfully, not fully understanding what the Pope meant. Now, standing in the shadow of the great basilica, those words echoed in his mind with new weight. The ceremony continued with ancient hymns sung in Latin. The crowd swayed gently, many holding candles despite the morning light. Andreas noticed an elderly woman in the crowd collapse from grief, quickly attended to by medical staff. A young boy held a sign that read, "Thank you, Papa Francisco," with a drawing of the Pope's smiling face. The atmosphere was thick with love and loss. As the funeral mass reached its most solemn moment, Cardinal Bellini stepped forward to deliver the homily. His voice cracked with emotion as he spoke about Pope Francis's dedication to the marginalized and forgotten. He talked about how the Pope had washed the feet of prisoners, embraced refugees, and constantly pushed the Church to be a place of welcome rather than exclusion. The crowd listened in rapt attention, many wiping tears from their eyes. Andreas felt his own eyes burning. He had seen the Pope's compassion firsthand. Once, during a rainy evening, Andreas had been standing guard when Pope Francis insisted on bringing him hot coffee and a blanket. "Even guardians need care," the Pope had said, with his characteristic warm smile. It was moments like these that made Pope Francis more than just a religious leader to Andreas. He was a reminder of what humanity could be at its best. The ceremony progressed through its carefully choreographed stages. Everything had been planned months in advance, as Vatican tradition demanded. Every movement, every prayer, every gesture had been rehearsed and approved by the congregation for divine worship. The Swiss guards had their specific role: to stand watch, to maintain formation, to represent the unchanging nature of the Church's protective force. They were living symbols of continuity in a world of constant change. But something was stirring in Andreas's chest. As he watched the simple wooden coffin, he remembered more of his conversations with Pope Francis. The Pope had often spoken about breaking down walls between people, about the danger of rigid thinking, about how love sometimes meant stepping outside comfortable boundaries. Andreas had always listened respectfully, but now these words felt like they were speaking directly to his current moment. Next to Andreas stood his fellow guard, Private Johann Weber, a 26-year-old from Zurich. Johann had noticed Andreas's unusual tension. The two had become close friends during their service, often sharing their thoughts during off-duty hours. Johann leaned slightly toward Andreas, barely moving his lips. "Are you all right?" he whispered so quietly that only Andreas could hear. Andreas didn't respond immediately. His mind was racing through a decision that was forming against his will. He thought about his training, about the sacred oath he had taken when he joined the Swiss Guard. He had sworn to protect the Pope and uphold the traditions of the Vatican with his life if necessary. Breaking formation during a papal funeral was unthinkable. It would be a disgrace to his family name, to his uniform, to the 500 years of Swiss Guard history. Yet something stronger was pulling at him. He looked at the coffin again and felt an overwhelming surge of grief mixed with gratitude. This man had changed his understanding of faith. Pope Francis had taught him that true service meant serving with your whole heart, not just following orders. The Pope had lived his message of mercy and authentic human connection until his very last breath. The choir began singing the hauntingly beautiful in Paradisum, the traditional song that accompanies the final commendation of the dead. The Latin words floated through the square, speaking of angels leading the deceased to paradise. The moment was approaching when the coffin would be carried to its final resting place in the Vatican grottos beneath St. Peter's Basilica. Andreas felt time slowing down. His hands tightened around his halberd. Sweat formed beneath his plumed helmet despite the cool morning air. He knew what he wanted to do, but the consequences flashed through his mind like lightning. Commander Christoph Fischer stood at the head of the Swiss Guard formation, his experienced eyes scanning his men for any sign of weakness or disorder. Fischer was a stern man in his 50s, a traditionalist who believed that discipline was the foundation of honor. He had served under 3 popes and had seen many changes in the Vatican, but he held firmly to the belief that some things should never change. The Swiss Guard's unwavering composure was one of those things. Andreas could feel the commander's presence like a weight on his shoulders. He knew that Fischer would view any breach of protocol as a personal betrayal. Yet as the pallbearers prepared to lift the coffin for its final journey, Andreas felt his body moving before his mind had fully decided. His right foot shifted forward, breaking the perfect line of guards. Johann's eyes widened in alarm beside him. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Andreas took another step, then another. His halberd remained in his hand, but his grip had loosened. The crowd nearest to him began to notice. A woman gasped. A photographer's camera clicked. Cardinal Bellini, who had just finished his homily, turned to see what was causing the disturbance. The cardinal's face showed confusion, then concern. Andreas walked directly toward the coffin. His fellow guards remained frozen in place, unsure whether to stop him or maintain their positions. Commander Fischer's face turned red with fury, but he too was bound by protocol. Moving to stop Andreas would create an even greater spectacle. The entire funeral seemed to hold its breath as this young Swiss Guard defied 5 centuries of tradition. When Andreas reached the coffin, he did something that no one expected. He fell to his knees, his armor clanking against the stone ground. He removed his plumed helmet, revealing his face to the thousands watching. Tears streamed down his cheeks openly, unashamedly. He placed his helmet on the ground and reached out to touch the simple wooden coffin with both hands. His shoulders shook with sobs. The square was utterly silent except for Andreas's crying. Even the choir had stopped singing, shocked by what they were witnessing. This was not part of any plan. This was not approved by any committee. This was raw human emotion breaking through the carefully constructed ceremony. It was messy, unexpected, and completely genuine. Andreas spoke. His voice choked with emotion but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Thank you, Holy Father. Thank you for teaching me that love is greater than rules. Thank you for seeing me as a person, not just a uniform. Thank you for showing us that God's love has no walls." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of profound grief and gratitude. Cardinal Bellini watched with wide eyes. As someone who had known Pope Francis well, he recognized immediately that this guard was embodying exactly what the Pope had preached. Pope Francis had constantly challenged the idea that formality and dignity required emotional distance. He had hugged the sick, kissed the feet of the poor, and cried openly when moved by suffering. This young guard, in his moment of defiance, was perhaps the most fitting tribute to the Pope's legacy. The crowd began to stir. Some people were shocked, viewing Andreas's actions as disrespectful to the solemnity of the occasion. Others were deeply moved, seeing in his tears the same grief they felt, but could not express so freely. A debate was beginning in real time among the thousands gathered. Was this appropriate? Was this beautiful? Was this exactly what Pope Francis would have wanted? Maria Castellano stood in the crowd with her 12-year-old son, Luca. They had traveled from Naples to attend the funeral, sleeping in their car because they couldn't afford a hotel. Pope Francis had visited their neighborhood 3 years ago, and Maria had never forgotten how he had stopped to bless Luca, who had been struggling with illness at the time. Luca had recovered. Maria credited both medicine and the Pope's blessing for her son's health. When Maria saw Andreas break formation and kneel at the coffin, she felt something crack open in her own heart. She had been trying to remain composed, to be dignified in her grief. But seeing this guard weep so openly gave her permission to release her own tears. She pulled Luca close, and they cried together, not in sadness alone, but in gratitude for having lived in the time of such a pope. Around them, something remarkable began to happen. One person, then another, then dozens, then hundreds began to kneel where they stood. It spread through the crowd like ripples in water. People who had been standing stiffly in formal respect lowered themselves to the ground. They removed their hats. They wept. The carefully controlled funeral was transforming into something more chaotic and more authentic. Commander Fisher stood paralyzed by indecision. His training told him to immediately remove Andreas from the scene, to restore order and dignity. But another part of him, a part he had kept buried under years of military discipline, recognized that something sacred was happening. He looked at the faces of the cardinals and bishops. Some looked scandalized, but others, including Cardinal Bellini, had tears in their own eyes. They too were kneeling now. Andreas remained at the coffin, his hands pressed against the wood as if trying to somehow communicate through it one last time, the man who had changed his life. He thought about his father back in Lucerne, who would certainly hear about this. His father, a man of strict tradition, might disown him. Andreas might lose his position in the Swiss Guard. He might become known as the guard who disgraced his uniform. But in this moment, none of that mattered. All that mattered was honoring the truth of what Pope Francis had taught him about love. Authenticity and human connection. Johann, Andreas's friend, made his own decision. He too stepped out of formation and walked to where Andreas knelt. He placed a hand on his friend's armored shoulder in solidarity. Then another guard joined them, and another. Within minutes, half of the Swiss guards who had been standing in perfect formation were kneeling around the coffin. It was an unprecedented sight. The Vatican photographers captured it all, their cameras clicking rapidly. Knowing they were documenting something historic, Commander Fisher finally moved, but not to punish. He walked slowly to the coffin and stood behind his guards. He didn't kneel himself, but he placed his hand on his chest over his heart and bowed his head deeply. It was his own compromise between duty and emotion, and it spoke volumes. The old soldier's eyes were glistening, though he fought to keep his tears from falling. In the Vatican press office, porters were frantically updating their stories. What had been planned as a traditional solemn papal funeral was becoming something entirely different. Social media was exploding with live footage of the kneeling guards. The hashtag SwissGuard tribute was already trending worldwide. Some commentators were calling it a beautiful moment of authentic grief. Others were criticizing it as a breakdown of necessary protocol. The debate was fierce and immediate, but in St. Peter's Square, The debate didn't matter. What mattered was the collective release of grief. The thousands gathered there were experiencing something that transcended rules and expectations. They were experiencing what Pope Francis had always preached, that genuine human emotion and connection were not obstacles to faith, but expressions of it. Sister Teresa Mendez, an elderly nun from Argentina, who had known Pope Francis when he was simply Father Jorge in Buenos Aires, watched the scene with a smile breaking through her tears. She remembered the young priest who had insisted on living in a simple apartment, rather than the elegant church quarters offered to him. She remembered how he would personally serve meals at the soup kitchen, refusing to let others do what he could do himself. Seeing the Swiss Guard break protocol to express genuine love reminded her that Jorge Bergoglio's message had truly taken root in unexpected hearts. Andreas finally raised his head from the coffin. His face was red and wet with tears, but there was peace in his eyes. He had done what his heart demanded, and he felt no regret. He slowly stood, his armor creaking, and picked up his helmet from the ground. He didn't put it back on immediately. Instead, he held it against his chest and turned to face Commander Fischer, ready to accept whatever consequences awaited him. But Fischer's expression had softened. The commander looked at Andreas for a long moment, and something passed between them. A recognition, perhaps, that duty and love were not always enemies. Fischer gave the slightest nod, then turned back to his position. It was not quite approval, but neither was it condemnation. It was acknowledgement that something beyond their protocol had occurred. The ceremony resumed, but it was forever changed. The remaining rituals were performed with a new tenderness. The cardinals who carried the coffin to its final resting place in the Vatican grottos moved with visible emotion, rather than just formal solemnity. The prayers were spoken with trembling voices. The incense seemed to carry not just tradition, but genuine sorrow and love into the air. As the crowd began to disperse after the funeral concluded, people approached Andreas. An old man from Poland grasped his hand and said, "Thank you for showing us that faith is alive." A young woman from Brazil embraced him quickly before security could intervene, whispering, "Papa Francisco would have loved what you did." A priest from India blessed him, saying, "You honored him more than any ceremony could." But not everyone was pleased. Andreas overheard angry conversations. Some traditional Catholics were scandalized, viewing his actions as a disgrace to the church's dignity. "The guards are supposed to be disciplined soldiers, not emotional children," one man said loudly. "This is exactly the kind of chaos that Pope Francis's reforms have encouraged," another complained. Andreas accepted these criticisms without defending himself. He understood that not everyone would see his actions as he did. Johann walked beside Andreas as they returned to their barracks. "You know there will be an inquiry," Johann said quietly. Andreas nodded. "I know, but I couldn't stand there like a statue anymore. Not for him." He deserved to know that his message reached at least one guard's heart. Johann smiled. "Not just one. You saw how many of us joined you. You gave us permission to be human." That evening, Andreas sat alone in his small room in the Vatican barracks. He had removed his uniform and wore simple civilian clothes. He expected a knock on his door at any moment, summoning him to face disciplinary action. He thought about calling his father, but decided to wait. Whatever happened next, he wanted to face it first before explaining himself to his family, instead of the expected summons from his superiors. Andreas received something else. A young priest knocked and handed him an envelope, saying only, "This was found in Pope Francis's personal effects. It's addressed to you." Andreas's hands shook as he opened it. The letter was brief. "I am writing this, knowing my time grows short. I want you to know that your service has meant more to me than protocol or tradition ever could. You have guarded not just my body, but have truly heard my words. When I am gone, do not let anyone tell you that expressing love is unprofessional, or that showing your humanity diminishes your duty. The greatest service you can offer is to be fully, honestly yourself. Be brave enough to let your heart guide your actions, even when traditions suggest otherwise. Thank you for seeing me as a person, not just a title. Your friend in Christ, Francis." Andreas read the letter 3 times, tears flowing freely again. The Pope had somehow known. Perhaps not the specific actions Andreas would take, but he had known that Andreas would face a moment when he would need to choose between rigid protocol and authentic expression. And he had given his blessing in advance. The next morning, Andreas was indeed called before a council of Vatican officials and Swiss Guard commanders. He stood in his dress uniform, prepared to accept dismissal if that was their decision. Commander Fischer sat among the council members, his face unreadable. Cardinal Bellini was also present, representing the broader church leadership. The head of the council, a stern cardinal in his 70s, spoke first. "Lieutenant Keller, your actions yesterday were highly irregular and broke long-standing protocol. What do you have to say for yourself?" Andreas stood straight and spoke clearly. "Your Eminence, I have no excuse except that I loved Pope Francis, and in that moment, love demanded more of me than protocol did. If that is a violation worthy of dismissal, I accept that consequence." The room was silent for a moment. Then Cardinal Bellini spoke. "May I say something?" The head cardinal nodded. Bellini stood and addressed both Andreas and the council. "I have been thinking about what we witnessed yesterday. Initially, I was shocked, even offended. But then I remembered something Pope Francis said to me shortly before he died. He said, 'Marco, I hope that when I'm gone, people will remember not the ceremonies, but the love. I hope they will dare to be human in a church that has sometimes forgotten humans are what we're here to serve,'" Bellini continued. Lieutenant Keller's actions were not a rejection of his duty, but a fulfillment of it in a way. It transcended the merely formal. He guarded the Pope's true legacy, which was always about authentic human connection over rigid tradition. "I believe we should not punish this, but consider what it teaches us." The council members looked at each other. Some nodded slowly. Others still seemed uncertain. Commander Fischer cleared his throat. "I have served the Vatican for 32 years. I have always believed that discipline is paramount. But yesterday, I witnessed something that challenged me. My guards were not abandoning their duty when they knelt. They were honoring it in a deeper way. Lieutenant Keller, I do not approve of breaking formation. But I understand why you did it, and I believe Pope Francis would have understood too." After deliberation, the council reached a decision. Andreas would receive a formal reprimand in his record, but he would not be dismissed. The reprimand was necessary to maintain that protocol still mattered, but the leniency acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances. Andreas accepted this outcome with grace. It was more than fair, and it allowed him to continue serving in the weeks that followed. Andreas's actions continued to spark debate around the world, but they also inspired something unexpected. People began sharing their own stories of times when they had chosen love over protocol, authenticity over appearance, humanity over rigid rules. Pope Francis's funeral, meant to be an ending, has become a catalyst for continuing his message in new ways. Andreas received hundreds of letters. Some condemned him, but many more thanked him. Parents wrote that they had used his example to teach their children about courage. Young people wrote that his actions had restored their faith in the church. Even some traditionalists, while disagreeing with his breach of protocol, admitted they were moved by his obvious sincerity. Maria and Luca from Naples sent him a photo of themselves at the funeral, kneeling in the crowd. "You helped us mourn," Maria wrote, "and you helped us celebrate a pope who deserves to be remembered with full hearts, not stiff traditions." Andreas kept this letter, along with Pope Francis's letter, in a wooden box on his desk. Years later, Andreas would still serve in the Swiss Guard. He never again broke formation at a formal ceremony. He didn't need to. That one moment had said everything that needed saying. But his fellow guards noticed that he performed his duties with a different quality afterward. He stood with the same discipline and precision, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. A warmth, a recognition of the humanity in everyone around him. When tourists would take photos with the Swiss Guards, Andreas would sometimes allow himself the smallest smile. Remembering Pope Francis's words about being fully honestly himself, and every year on the anniversary of Pope Francis's death, Andreas would visit the tomb in the Vatican grottos. He would stand in his civilian clothes, no longer on duty, but still serving in his own way, and say a quiet prayer of thanks for the Pope who taught him that the greatest tradition of all is love.